I've been thinking for some time now about problems with archaeology. I use logic. I'm not a scientist or an archaeologist, so I can't exactly do a deep dive on how they organize or categorize the data that they collect, the evidence, their findings. But one of my biggest observations about the archaeological timeline, they say humans came into their own, we came into our own 100,000, maybe 200,000 years ago. I'll go with 100,000. That's fine. And they have no problem admitting that humans 100,000 years ago were very culturally diverse or developed, I guess. Yeah. Even cave paintings, very sophisticated. I think dated as far back as 50,000 years ago. So this is quite substantial, quote, development that they say we had, became. And yet, we didn't learn to domesticate animals or figure out some kind of domestication on a grand scale anyway until 10,000 years ago. Same with agriculture. We didn't figure out how to plant what we eat by design, plant by with purpose agriculture. That's what I am. Until roughly 10,000 years ago. Just the logical approach, like common sense, a simple observation. It took us 90,000 years to figure out the plants we eat grow where we pooped. Or, the quote seeds. I don't know what they would have called them back then. The immaterial that we don't eat, I guess. The plant material that we don't eat, which would be the seeds for sure, where we toss them, at the time, like over the course of 90,000 years, we never saw that they grow where we tossed those things inside, the things that we eat, so to speak. 90,000 years, we're doing cave paintings, sophisticated cave paintings. We have a sophisticated culture. What it took us 90,000 years to figure out how to control the plants that we eat, called agriculture. Just a logical observation. It's a legitimate observation. That's problematic. That's laughable, just from a common sense perspective. But even animals. We never came across baby animals and thought, what if we raised it? Let alone, multiple baby animals. We come just modern human. Why is it? Oh, it's like a modern human. Yeah, ancient man would have been too hungry. They would have just killed whatever they could. That's laughable. They had culture. They clearly appreciated animals. They are doing cave paintings of animals. It's absurd to not think after a hunt, or like a herd of gazelle or something, and there's stranded calves, and they will kill it for 90,000 years, not capture them, corral them, or even there's a herd, erect like a fence or something, some kind of whatever. Yeah, that's a little more less likely, but coming across baby animals and just kill them, not just raise them and see what happens and experiment because, hey, this is our food. The idea that we can't, it took us 90,000 years, just a lot from a logical perspective. It's laughable. So those are two observations I made about archaeology and why it doesn't make sense. The observation is tangible, and it If it's real, then the amount of corruption with the archaeological field is shockingly, you know, rancid. You know, it's saturated. It'd have to be. It just does not make sense, and to allow scholars to just say, you know, you're not a scholar, you can't comprehend, or logic, Todd, that's the dumbest thing we've ever heard. To allow scholars to say whatever, you know, maybe they'll be kinder, but they're pretty much saying that you're too dumb. You can't make a logical observation that undermines all of archaeology. Wait, who are you to have the answer that disagrees with all of archaeology? Well, I made the observation. The observation speaks for itself. The idea that it took us 90,000 years when we're fully developed, which they fully acknowledge, even Neanderthal man, they say, had culture. Never mind, Neanderthal man had brains bigger than us. I very much no, Neanderthal man, they were men. They were humans. I don't think that they were, what is it, a transitional species from ape to man. I just, no, they were humans. The fact that they had brains bigger than us, and also concerning Neanderthal man, another observation, funny enough, is based on what they observed back when they found the skull, the first Neanderthal skull. They had no science to go on, and they decided that Neanderthal man had undeveloped or underdeveloped frontal lobes just because the forehead was, you know, sunken in some fashion. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and yet this is stance. This is archaeology for you. They concluded Neanderthal man had an underdeveloped brain just because of the shape of the skull, when the shape of the skull doesn't mean jack shit. That's just a fact. They didn't have any science to know anything, and yet they concluded. Another observation, it's interesting that the oldest writing, you know, so archaeologists would say that we know of, sure, the oldest writing that we know of dates back to 4,500 years ago. I think because it's harder to manipulate the evidence, I would say, maybe. Why they didn't manipulate it to say, oh, the oldest writing goes back 20,000 years ago. I don't know why. I'm guessing because it was harder to manipulate. The evidence that's so easy to manipulate would be nomadic lifestyles. You can date that however far back you want. But the archaeological finds that are harder to manipulate in terms of how far back you want to go, writing, and actual kind of settlements, like the beginning of building cities and empires. The farthest back that goes, roughly 10,000 years ago. You know, once we supposedly figured out agriculture, which is laughable, and domestication of animals 10,000 years ago, oh, we can now settle. We can just stay in the same spot. And, you know, obviously the natural development is building cities. It's interesting that they just couldn't go beyond when you think in terms of Noah's Ark. Yeah, that's where I'm going with this, Noah's Ark. According to the Holy Bible, we, you know, exited Noah's Ark 4,500 years ago, roughly, which is right when the oldest writings date to. And, you know, these are just general observations, but they're tangible. And you could just the general reality of agenda-driven science. Archaeologists have an agenda. If you listen to them, or just atheists, it's so easy to recognize an agenda. It's any science that's driven by an agenda is going to be corrupted, manipulated. They have to stick with the narrative. You know, those are some observations I've made. And I totally own it. They're just observations, but it's common sense. There's no way it took us 90,000 years to figure out the benefit of capturing animals and raising them. Um, just the general reality of discovering baby animals, which we do all the time, modern man do. I've come across a baby bird, um, baby snake, and just after a hunt, once again, stranded calves. You chase a herd, and then just plants. Once that too, it's laughable. So anyway, those are my thoughts.